Now, as far as topics for criticism, for analysis, I would say that over the years I've come to understand that what is really interesting for me is narrative. And that novels and films have in common, maybe other kinds of arts have that in common. In the period when I was looking at architecture, I would ask myself, how can architecture be described in narrative terms? Le Corbusier had an idea of the trajectory. That is, a house, a space would be formed by a trajectory. Is that narrative or not? And maybe later on when we talk about music, we can think about that too. And that's why, and I think that's what these seem very different to people, but for my mind, they're all questions of narrative. And narrative is then, I would say, fundamental to personal experience because we tell ourselves the stories of these experiences. So it's fundamental for psychoanalysis, and it's also fundamental for history. What is history but turning brute events into narratives of some kind, and the conflict of these narratives with each other. The stories, I've noticed that all of this emerges in the public sphere, in newspapers, on television and so on, in recent years, maybe again this last few decades. Suddenly everybody's talking about narrative. They didn't used to do that back in the 50s and before. What is the narrative? The narrative of these events, the president gave us this narrative and so on and so forth. The word narrative, at least in the United States, is everywhere. Well, it's a kind of recognition that our sense of reality is always takes the shape of a narrative. So the difference between these narratives and their clashes, because I think much in intellectual life is a clash of narratives, is a conflict of narratives, is based on that deeper. I don't want to make an ontology of it, but I think that a narrative is a very fundamental, space for understanding reality, or at least it is for me, and it's central in my work.